I've chosen this particular site because one of the giants of the Middle East died on the 21st of March this year. It's like somebody you've never heard about, but somebody whose name is known by everyone in the Middle East. I'm talking about Nawal el-Saadawi, who died at the age of 90 in Cairo on the 21st of March. So why is this name so influential here in the Arab world and almost unknown in the West? Nawal was born in the Nile Delta on the 27th of October 1931. Her father and mother had been exiled. He was a civil servant in the Ministry of Education when Egypt was under British occupation, and he was involved in the 1919 revolt against the British occupation of Egypt, the failed revolt, and he was basically sent to a small town in the Nile Delta as punishment. And it wasn't until a decade later that he came back into Cairo. Her mother had 9 children. She was the second of 9 children. She went through the usual experiences that you'd expect that a young Arab woman would go through, or a girl would go through, in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, right up till the middle of the first decade of the 21st century. Genital mutilation. She had a clitoris removed at the age 6, and at age 10 she was to be married, but her mother was against the marriage, and unfortunately both her parents died relatively young, and she was left responsible for the welfare of her 8 brothers and sisters. She went to Cairo University and in 1955 graduated as a medical doctor. An unusual situation in Egypt in 1955. The fact she went back to her hometown, worked as a doctor for a number of years, and then returned to Cairo. In 1957, she wrote her first book, I Learned Love, and this was followed a year later by the memoirs of a woman doctor. She was a bright woman, worked hard, and was snapped up by the Ministry of Health, and by 1970 she was the director of the Ministry of Health in Egypt, a senior bureaucrat in the Egyptian Ministry of Health. In 1972 everything changed. She wrote the seminal book Woman and Sex, which has had a profound impact on women across the Middle East for decades. For her troubles, she was fired as the director of the Ministry of Health. She lost her position as the Assistant Secretary of the Egyptian Medical Association. She also lost of her position as the chief editor of the Health magazine. So she paid a price for outlining what was happening through the Arab world in 1972. Thrown to her own devices, she was able to obtain work in a number of universities in Egypt. When you look at Nawal's work, she was different to many feminists, especially many Western feminists. She was not only against patriarchal oppression. All her life she fought against cultural oppression. She fought against totalitarianism, both secular and religious. And let's not forget that religion plays a pivotal part in the lives of most people in the Arab world. She fought against class oppression, and being a victim of imperialism, she fought against imperialist oppression. And before her death she said that female oppression, to a significant degree in a postmodern world, is due to capitalism and the support of the capitalist system by religious fundamentalism. And you think it's an irony or an interesting conjunction, capitalism and religious fundamentalism. Let's not forget the United States has propped up feudal monarchies in the Middle East, which are basically based on capitalist values, corporate capitalist values, for generations. And even during the Arab Spring, the United States, concerned about the spread of real democracy in the Middle East, sided with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and other fundamentalist groups across the Middle East to defeat the Arab Spring. But getting back to Nawal's involvement in these issues, she saw oppression in its various guises. She wasn't fixated on one form of oppression, thinking that if you remove one form of oppression, that if you remove the patriarchy, or you remove class, or you remove religious oppression, that things would change. She saw that change, to a significant degree, was based on that struggle against oppression in all its forms. In 1981, she was jailed by Anwar Sadat for her criticisms of the Sadat regime and her formation of the first feminist magazine in the Middle East, Confrontation. She was the editor and publisher of Confrontation. She found herself in prison and was only released after Sadat had been assassinated by fundamentalists. Her life continued, and in 1982 she formed the Arab Women's Solidarity Association, which she claimed was a historical, socialist, feminist organisation. She's also the co-founder of the Arab Human Rights Association. These were particularly difficult periods because of the rise of Muslim fundamentalism, which was funded by the House of Saudi in Saudi Arabia across the Middle East, and the spread of Wahhabism, not just in the Middle East but in Indonesia and Malaysia, through the support and money of the House of Saudi. It became an exceptionally difficult situation for her. In 1985 she published memoirs of the women's prison, of the time she spent in prison. She also published another prison novel, Woman Beyond Zero. So she continued to publish because, as she said, when I first took up the pen in 1957, I signed my own death warrant because people don't want to listen. But at the same time she understood, being an atheist, that when she died it would be the words that she left on paper which would be so important in spreading her ideas about oppression and feminism around the Middle East and the rest of the world. In many regards she was similar to Emma Goldman, Simone de Beauvoir, Louise Michel, those radical feminists who believed and fought against all forms of oppression. In 1988, because of threats from religious fundamentalists who were not able to tolerate her ideas, who wanted to destroy the influence that she had had in the Arab world, especially among women in the Arab world, were sent out to assassinate her. Warned of the assassination, she fled to the United States and taught at Duke University in North Carolina, as well as the Sorbonne in France, and a number of other universities in the Western world until 1996, when she'd returned to Cairo. Now, she always wrote in Arabic. Although a fluent speaker in English, she made the decision early on in her life that she was part of the Pan-Arabic movement, and she wrote all her novels in Arabic. Not French, not English, but Arabic, which made her ideas exceptionally powerful in the Middle East setting, because she never disavowed her Arab cultural background. Although she described herself as an atheist and a feminist and somebody who was against oppression of all types, she maintained her Arab identity and maintained her Arab language and wrote all her books in Arabic. Books like The Fall of the Imam, one of the most significant books written in the 20th century regarding the negative effects of religion on children and women. God Died on the Nile, another book which actually looked at religious fundamentalism. Eve Behind the Veil. She saw the veil as a form of oppression. Another book that she wrote, which had wide readings. So she was never influential in terms of politics, because she was never elected to any office. But she was influential in a much more important way. She was influential in terms of spreading ideas in a hostile environment, an exceptionally hostile environment where her life was always at risk because of the rise of religious fundamentalism. She was in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring in 2011. She opposed Western capitalism in all its forms. She saw the war in Afghanistan as a war about oil. She saw the war against terrorism as a fake war. She saw that the real war on terrorism was the war that Israel was conducting in the Arab world. She never forgot her humble beginnings. She always believed that capitalism and class were fundamental to postmodern oppression, and with the rise of religious fundamentalism, which all its guises is capitalist inclined, and the coalition between capitalism and religious fundamentalism, which came about to destroy the Arab Spring and that longing for democracy and freedom, which the people of the Middle East, the Arab world and the non-Arab world in the Middle East, have always yearned for, didn't crush Nawal. She continued to write, she continued to speak out, she was invited to many conferences around the world, she received many honours, Western honours. She didn't see liberalism as some type of Western concept. She saw the struggle against oppression as a universal struggle that each and every one of us is involved with on a daily basis, whether we acknowledge it or not. She saw that change came from activism, not from accepting of cultural totalitarianism, not accepting religious fundamentalism, not accepting the patriarchy, not accepting class oppression. A film was made about her in 2017 called She Spoke the Unspeakable. And she did speak the unspeakable, because she just didn't concentrate on one form of oppression. She concentrated on all forms of oppression. In 2008, after a long campaign against genital mutilation, the practice was outlawed in Egypt. It doesn't mean it ceased, but it was outlawed in Egypt. And it's been outlawed in many other parts of the Middle East because of the work of people like Nawal el-Saadawi. So this is an extraordinary woman. In my opinion, she's the most influential woman in the Middle East in the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century. She didn't rest on her laurels. At the age of 85, she wrote a book, Notebook of a Young Girl at 85. A little bit of a sense of humour there. One of her great novels was Zina, which was published in 2009. And the film, which was produced by Jill Nichols, She Spoke the Unspeakable, gives you a good insight. She never accepted many aspects of Western culture. She'd never accepted against the commodification and exploitation of women's bodies, which is a central feature of many Western societies. She never accepted that, never wore makeup, never coloured her hair, aged gracefully. And at the age of 90, she died in a Cairo hospital. The tragedy is, and there is a tragedy in her death, the tragedy is that she is not acknowledged by her peers. Her death has not been acknowledged by the state of Egypt. No state funeral has been organised for her. The Medical Association of Egypt has refused to give condolences to her surviving family. And most outlets in Egyptian society still concerned about the influence that Nawal el-Saadawi has on Egyptian women and women in the Middle East, continue to ignore what she did. Her books are banned in most countries in the Middle East, although there are ways of getting those books, and they are popular amongst Arab women around the world, not just in the Middle East, but around the world. So she proved one thing: the individual can make a difference. You don't need to be a dictator. You don't need to kill tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in war. You can be influential through the strength of your ideas and the strength of purpose that you have. As an atheist in a religious, fundamentalist-dominated society, she continued to speak out against oppression. Oppression at all levels: class oppression, patriarchal oppression, totalitarian political oppression, both secular and religious fundamentalist oppression, imperialist oppression, oppression by capitalism, by corporate capitalism in the postmodern world. We won't forget her. And in many regards, most of the policies that we have in public interest before corporate interests reflect those same principles. We are not fixated on one form of oppression, whether it's patriarchy or class. Our struggle is against all forms of oppression. And I hope that through this little clip that we can pay our dues to activists like Nawal el-Saadawi, who have made so many sacrifices for so many decades in so many places around the world. And people like her, men and women like her, will continue to be born and continue to push that struggle against oppression in all its guises. For far too long, the West has been fixated on one form of oppression or another form of oppression. It has not led that struggle against all forms of oppression. If you're interested in that, then I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests. Hopefully, before the end of the year, we'll be registered as a federal political party, and we can continue that struggle, not just in the extra-parliamentary realm, not just through boycotts, industrial disputes, protests, petitions, but through introducing these ideas during the electoral process. Thank you, and rest in peace, Nawal el-Saadawi.